I'd like to welcome Daniel Goleman, the world's leading expert on emotional intelligence and social intelligence, and the creator of the Wired to Connect series. Daniel, welcome.
Thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Daniel, you are an author of many world-leading books, including Emotional Intelligence and Social Intelligence. So why did you go on to create an audio series called Wired to Connect?
Well, I'm basically a writer and a thinker, and I like to think deeply about topics. And I got very excited about this new area of brain research called social neuroscience, which explains that newly discovered circuits in the brain create a very intimate person-to-person linkage when you're interacting with someone. This is the superhighway for simpatico, for chemistry, for love, for business being effective. And it has so many implications. I explored as many as I could in the book Social Intelligence, but I found there was a lot more to say after I was done with the book. And this is the problem with writing books. The book ends, but your thinking doesn't. So I wanted to keep exploring more deeply into the whole range of implications. So I realized what I could do was get together with people whose research fascinated me, or whose thinking really pushed the edge in this area, and have a deep conversation with them and do it as an audio conversation. So the Wired to Connect series is 6 or 7 of these, going into areas that include everything from the various kinds of empathy and how each of them matters, or what we can do to enhance the brain's ability to be socially intelligent, to be emotionally intelligent, and what's the neuroscience behind creating better skills in this critical set of human abilities to what does it mean to have good work, that is work that you feel really satisfied by, that's intrinsically fulfilling, and what are the ingredients of that? And another one that I found really fascinating was, how does the social brain interact with the virtual world, with email, with communicating by phone? Why is it that we have our best interactions face-to-face and we have more disastrous interactions on email? And what does that mean, for example, if you're managing a global team? How can you orchestrate face-to-face interaction versus working at a distance so that the team is a high-performing team? So these were many of the areas that I was able to go into, and I feel really very satisfied with the series, both in terms of being able to extend my work in social intelligence, and also I found a way to explore new ideas without having to write a whole book about it.
Fantastic. I've listened to the series and they are inspirational. They're great. Daniel, there's so much negative news at the moment around sort of the recession, and maybe it's not even a normal recession, it's more likely to be a depression, and even it's the end of capitalism and Armageddon's going to follow. So how important is it for leaders under the crisis that we're in at the moment to remain calm and focused and positive?
Well, when I was talking with Richard Davidson, who's one of the world's most eminent brain scientists who studies emotions in the brain, it's very clear that there is an interaction between our emotional centers, the centers for distress and alarm, which in a downturn, of course, are being triggered all the time because there's so much fear in the air. There's a relationship between that and the prefrontal cortex, the brain's executive center, the part of the brain that helps us think clearly, take in information fully, respond adaptively. The more alarm the brain is experiencing, the more distressing emotions, the more crippled the executive center becomes. So that means that in a climate where there's fear in the air, when there's fear in the company, it's very important for leaders to be able to be calm themselves, to manage their own anxiety, and then to communicate that and express that to the people that they depend on for the success of the operation. In other words, leaders get results through people. And one of the leaders' tasks at a primal level is to help their people be in the best emotional state and brain state so they can work at their best. So that means 2 things. Manage fear, and the second is inspire hope. And keep people focused on where we're going. Not how bad it is now, but how it can be once we get through this and go onward. And the reason is that that activates a part of the brain, the left prefrontal cortex, which is the center for positive emotion and also for continuing to work toward goals no matter what the obstacles are today. So there may be a lot of things that aren't working out right now for an individual, for a company, but if we can keep our minds on that goal, what that does is activate a center that gives us a visceral sense of how good it's going to feel when we get there. And that feeling is the primal motivating and driving force that keeps people going forward no matter how tough it may be right now.
Daniel, the US voted for Barack Obama over John McCain to become the CEO of the USA, or the president of the country. But what leadership lessons can we learn from his presidential victory?
Given the importance of fear on the one hand and hope on the other, how might that relate to the decision, the hiring decision, if you will, to select Barack Obama over John McCain as the CEO, as it were, of the country? We had a very large hiring committee involved, and a lot of people to sway. And I think the reason Obama won was because of his mode of handling the financial crisis. He embodied the ability to stay calm under pressure. He showed us that he could be cool in crisis. And that is an extremely important message for people, because in crisis, everyone looks to the leader to get a sense of how should we be reacting. And if the leader is panicking, then why are we going to stay calm? But if the leader is calm, cool, collected, focused, and Obama was, then we feel confidence. We feel there's someone steering the ship that knows how to get us out of this trouble. And the critical point came in the U.S. election just when McCain and Obama were neck and neck in the polls, and then the financial crisis hit, and all of a sudden McCain lost it. One day he said, I'm going to stop campaigning, I'm going to go to Washington and solve this problem. He did. He flew to Washington. Nothing happened. Didn't make any difference. Obama said, if you're president, you should be able to do two things at once, campaign and handle a crisis. He kept going on both tracks, and you could tell just by seeing him, he actually was calm. And that was a very reassuring message. And what that means also, and I think people sense this intuitively, is that people who do stay calm under crisis can use their cognitive abilities better because of the way the brain is designed. In crisis, when we're distressed, when we're anxious, that activation actually handicaps the thinking brain, the cognitive centers that help us pay attention, stay focused, take in information, understand it, respond well. And Obama showed us that he had that capacity. And I think that's why Americans then shifted, and he won basically in a landslide after that.
And do you think his external calmness was a real reflection of how he was feeling on the inside? Or do you think he was acting it because, he's read your books?
I doubt that Barack Obama has read my books, although I do know people who know him well, and they say he's always been like that. He has that capacity, and I think he's going to be a very good chief executive.
Daniel, and the ability to be able to operate calmly in a moment of crisis, is that something you're born with, or can you acquire that through learning?
Well, the question is, what makes a person able and capable in crisis to stay cool? Is that just something you're born with, or is it something you learn? And to some extent, people are born with a given temperament. The work of Richard Davidson, we go over this in the conversation I had with him in the Wired to Connect series. He says there are three kinds of emotional differences that you see in people, stylistic differences, that show up pretty much from birth. One is that some people are very quick to anger or anxiety, and some people are very slow. Some people experience their distressing emotions very, very, very strongly. Some people don't experience them that deeply, rather lightly. And then the third is some people take a long time to recover, stays with them, 2 in the morning, they're still thinking about whatever it was that upset them. And other people are able to drop them pretty quickly, just to let it go. And someone like Barack Obama is someone who doesn't get very anxious very quickly, doesn't seem to be very anxious, and seems to be able to let it go. Other people could be quite the opposite. So that's a temperamental given. Part of it. No emotional capacity is entirely genetic nor entirely learned. Any emotional competence is both a given and learned. And in fact, most of emotional intelligence abilities are largely learned and learnable. So someone who does have a temperament where they get more anxious and takes them longer to recover actually can retrain their brain so that they develop the capacity to manage their distressing emotions better. And one of the key elements is being able to monitor your emotions, to be mindful of your emotions. So LeadersIn has done a lot of work now with training people, for example, in a very high-pressure biotech startup company. He had someone, John Kabat-Zinn, who's a world expert on mindfulness training, come in and teach people a simple practice of developing the capacity simply to observe what's going on in your mind without getting caught up in it, swept away in it, or reacting or judging. Just knowing. And that meta-awareness, this capacity to hover over what's going on, is the critical step in managing it. Because if you see what's going on, then you can take steps to change things for the better. And in fact, it turns out that merely getting into that hovering position of the mind starts to short-circuit the emotional distress. So that's a critical ability. And what that does is help us distinguish between our awareness of the emotion and the emotion itself. If we don't have that awareness, then it's just going to sweep us away.
It's interesting, Daniel, because you talk about how important it is to bring consciousness back into emotion, to sort of push the time between impulse and action as absolutely critical before you react. So is that why emails can be so dangerous?
Now, when we're face-to-face with someone, so a part of the brain, which I describe in the book Social Intelligence and then more deeply in the series Wired to Connect, the part of the brain called the social brain, actually, is monitoring the person we're with continually, moment to moment, microsecond to microsecond, and telling us unconsciously, well, this person is responding that way to what you just did, so what you should do next is the following in order to keep things smooth, harmonious, on track, on the same page. This is what makes interactions go smoothly, this part of the brain. That part of the brain, however, is crippled online. When you're sitting there in front of your video screen, there's no feedback loop. All you have is the words you send. However, there's a kind of optical illusion of the mind that goes on where you assume, because it's true in all other interactions, and the brain is wired this way, that all of your little emotional signals that go with whatever you say and do face-to-face are going along with your email. But they're not. And that means that there is an actual negativity bias in email where senders think that a message was positive, but that's because they assume all the other cues went along. It's an unconscious assumption. Receivers think that that positive email was more neutral. When the sender thinks it's neutral, receivers tend to think it's more negative. In other words, there's a negativity skew to email generally. That's baseline. But then there's another problem. And that is very often in face-to-face interaction, you get an impulse to do something or say something, and your social brain says, that's not going to be effective. But that message never comes back to you when you're sitting writing an email, because there's no feedback loop. The result is what's called flaming. Flaming has been known since the earliest days of email. It's when you're worked up about something and you sit down and you furiously type out a message, you hit send, for a split second you have a feeling of satisfaction, and then this morbid sense of, oh my God, why did I do that? Why did I say that? Hits you. Yeah, that's a flame. And it's a disaster. And it's a disaster that would not have occurred face to face, most likely.
Daniel, you talk about the sort of a cultural clash between the Westerners and the people in the Far East, because the Asians are much more sort of collectivist in their approach to business and family and everything else. Over here, it's much more the role of the individual. So, can you tell us about that and the possible implications on people doing business in the Far East?
Anyone who's lived in Asia for any length of time, particularly in East Asian culture, and who's from the West, has noticed that there's a real difference in how Asian cultures relate to themselves, people in Asian cultures, and Westerners. In the conversation I had with Howard Gardner, on the series Wired to Connect, we go into this more deeply, but in short, in Asia, the self is an expanded self. It's your family, it's your unit, it's your clan. It's not just you as an individual. This is in stark contrast to individualist cultures in the West, where it's all about me. It's not my family. And the most extreme cultures this way are Australia, UK, the US, and so on. And this means that there's a very different sense of who who my ambition is for. In the East, it's for my company and me. It's my family and me. And in the West, it's more often than not just me. And that creates interesting problems both ways. But it also means that when we relate across cultures, we need to understand what the deep motivation is and what the orientation toward the self is of the people we're working with.
So is that why in China, Guangxi and the connections and partnership relationship management is so critical, as opposed to it's more relationship, less transactional, like it is over here in the West?
One of the signs of a collectivist culture is that relationships are fundamentally important. You would never, in a collectivist culture, you would never just sit down with someone you've never met and just go straight into the business agenda. You could do that easily in the States. It's quite appropriate there. You might have a little bit of chit-chat. In Asia, you'd have tea, you'd have a drink, you'd get to know each other, talk about your family and your life and so on. Then at some point you get around to the business part. But that's because you can't do business without a relationship. And many Westerners who start doing business in the East misunderstand this. And they really make a very bad impression. And also, when it can work the other way too, in that Westerners who are not used to working cross-culturally can be frustrated by the fact that these people who've come to do business with us don't seem to be interested in business, not understanding that first they want to form a sense of a relationship.
Okay. So if I interview a Chinese person soon, it will probably be a 3 or 4 hour interview as opposed to...
Yeah, but you could have a good meal.
Yeah, exactly. By the way, if you'd like to go out for a meal after this, I'll be delighted. As part of your Wired to Connect series, you have a fascinating discussion with Naomi Wolf.
Well, Naomi Wolf, who of course is best known for her work in women's issues and so on, also has co-founded an Institute for Ethical Leadership. And one of the programs they run there is for early career women, because they've found that many women who are going into the professions, going into business, have to overcome early socialization. And that socialization basically is that their role is to be the one who keeps things harmonious, to kind of step back and be a supporter rather than the focal player. And so they tend to feel less self-confidence, for example, in presenting in a presentation, in a meeting or so on. And for that reason, she's developed a program that helps overcome this so that women early in the career can develop the confidence they need to succeed. And by the way, I should say that lots of data on emotional intelligence, converging data, does show that on average, women relative to men have less self-confidence in a business setting, except, and this is quite critical, data point, star performers, outstanding performers, top leaders. Women there are just as confident as men in the same position. So what Naomi Wolf's program is doing is helping women get to the point earlier in the career where they'll have the kind of self-confidence. And they do it in a few ways. One is first by setting up situations where people are put on the spot. You know, you've got to give a stump speech right now. Doesn't matter if you're not prepared, go ahead and do it. But they do that in the context of what's called a safe haven. A safe haven is a highly supportive emotional environment where you're basically feeling a lot of love and support for you no matter what. So you can go ahead, fail, but it's not going to be a disaster. You'll get feedback, you'll learn how to improve and so on. And she finds that that's a learning environment in which people can, in fact, become far more confident. The other thing that we explored was this notion of ethical leadership and how one of the implicit tasks of a leader is to set ethical norms. And by ethical norms, we don't mean, you know, some high-fluting ethical code. We mean how people are with each other day to day. What are the ground rules for our interacting? You know, are we going to be honest or not so honest? Are we going to be open with people about problems we have with them, or just gossip about them behind their back? Well, if you're open with people and you put it out on the table and do it in a positive, collaborative way, you can settle those differences and get on with the work. If not, if you just start, you know, developing little cliques and this group is against that person, so it's a disaster for the working environment. So in other words, the leader's ethical task is to be an exemplar, to show how to do this, to model this, and to encourage other people to follow those norms and to praise them when they do, and to draw a line when they don't.
Because Daniel, I think success ultimately lies on you being able to move outside of your comfort zone. And you talk about the concept of feel the fear and do it anyway. So can you just talk to us about what that means?
The principle that one should feel the fear but do it anyway is absolutely crucial and for success in any domain of life. Anyone, even in the sports, if you're held back by your fears, you'll never get anywhere. You'll never try the new thing, the golf swing, the whatever it is. But in order to progress, you have to fight through your fear, try out the new thing, practice it until you get better, and so on. That's why, for example, in the Naomi Wolf's Institute for Ethical Leadership, when people are feeling a lack of self-confidence, they're told to go ahead and do it anyway. Feel the fear and do it anyway. And also in setting ethical norms, people may feel a little uncomfortable about it, but once you start to get used to it, it becomes the way we are together. And you can build an extremely high-performance collaborative team that way.
Daniel, you talk a lot about empathy in leadership and how important it is, and you bring up different types of empathy, including cognitive empathy and emotional empathy, etc. So can you just give us some insights as to how empathy is so central to leadership success?
Empathy is one of the critical components of social intelligence and leadership abilities. But in the conversation I did with Paul Ekman, who's a world expert on empathy in the Wired to Connect series, I realized that there are three kinds of empathy, and each one of them has strengths that are critical for effective leadership, but in different ways. And some of them have liabilities. The first one is cognitive empathy. That means I understand how you think about things. I can see things from your perspective. And that can be very effective, for example, for giving performance feedback or for communication, because I know how to put it to you in a way that you'll really be able to hear, that makes sense for you. So that's the upside. The downside is that people who only have cognitive empathy and who have twisted motivation, if you will, can use it to manipulate people. If you only care about yourself, you don't care about the other person, you can use that to your advantage. And you see that in narcissistic leaders, you see it in Machiavellian types, you see it in outright sociopaths. They use their understanding of the other person to manipulate them because they don't have the second kind of empathy. The second kind of empathy is emotional empathy. I feel with you. If I don't care about how you feel, then I don't mind making you feel terribly, or I don't mind taking great advantage of you. But if I feel your distress, it's much harder for me to do that. Emotional empathy is also critical for leadership, for any job where you relate to people, client management, sales management, teamwork, because it's the emotional empathy that creates chemistry, that creates the sense of being in rapport with other people, that creates simpatico. And it's in those moments where things go at their best. Top performing teams have this sense of harmony and of emotional connection with each other, for example. So emotional empathy is absolutely critical. However, the downside here is that, for example, if you're the person in HR who has to go around and tell everybody that you're fired, or you're a nurse working in pediatric oncology, and you're all day long you're with children who are in great pain or who are going to die. These are very powerful situations emotionally, and you pick up the distress that other people are feeling. If you can't metabolize that, if you can't manage it yourself, it can lead to a kind of emotional exhaustion, which is a prelude to burnout. And you feel, I've got to get out of this field. I can't do this anymore. So the counter to emotional empathy, and what allows you to use it effectively, is emotional self-management skills, which is one of the 4 parts of emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence is self-awareness, self-management, empathy, and relationship skills. So the different components work together. The third kind of empathy is empathic concern. And this is the felt sense that when I see that you're in trouble, I spontaneously want to help you out. This actually is what makes leaders outstanding. These are the leaders who, for example, take the time to help people develop further strengths. Take the time to give feedback, corrective feedback. They see that and are genuinely concerned about helping people get better, learn to do better, and that, of course, strengthens the capacity of the whole organization. That's also what makes people outstanding organizational citizens. These are the people who aren't just, it's me first and that's all I care about, but are good team players, are willing to help out other people, and so on. So in this in a dark time economically, the leaders who will be most effective have all 3 capacities going at full strength.
Daniel, you talk a lot about empathy in leadership and how important it is, and you bring up different types of empathy, including cognitive empathy and emotional empathy, etc. So can you just give us some insights as to how empathy is so central to leadership success?
Empathy is one of the critical components of social intelligence and leadership abilities. But in the conversation I did with Paul Ekman, who's a world expert on empathy in the Wired to Connect series, I realized that there are 3 kinds of empathy, and each one of them has strengths that are critical for effective leadership, but in different ways. And some of them have liabilities. The first one is cognitive empathy. That means I understand how you think about things. I can see things from your perspective. And that can be very effective, for example, for giving performance feedback or for communication, because I know how to put it to you in a way that you'll really be able to hear, that makes sense for you. So that's the upside. The downside is that people who only have cognitive empathy and who have twisted motivation, if you will, can use it to manipulate people. If you only care about yourself, you don't care about the other person, you can use that to your advantage. And you see that in narcissistic leaders, you see it in Machiavellian types, you see it in outright sociopaths. They use their understanding of the other person to manipulate them because they don't have the second kind of empathy. The second kind of empathy is emotional empathy. I feel with you. If I don't care about how you feel, then I don't mind making you feel terribly, or I don't mind taking great advantage of you. But if I feel your distress, it's much harder for me to do that. Emotional empathy is also critical for leadership, for any job where you relate to people, client management, sales management, teamwork, because it's the emotional empathy that creates chemistry, that creates the sense of being in rapport with other people, that creates simpatico. And it's in those moments where things go at their best. Top performing teams have this sense of harmony and of emotional connection with each other, for example. So emotional empathy is absolutely critical. However, the downside here is that, for example, if you're the person in HR who has to go around and tell everybody that you're fired, or you're a nurse working in pediatric oncology, and you're all day long you're with children who are in great pain or who are going to die. These are very powerful situations emotionally, and you pick up the distress that other people are feeling. If you can't metabolize that, if you can't manage it yourself, it can lead to a kind of emotional exhaustion, which is a prelude to burnout. And you feel, I've got to get out of this field. I can't do this anymore. So the counter to emotional empathy, and what allows you to use it effectively, is emotional self-management skills, which is one of the 4 parts of emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence is self-awareness, self-management, empathy, and relationship skills. So the different components work together. The third kind of empathy is empathic concern. And this is the felt sense that when I see that you're in trouble, I spontaneously want to help you out. This actually is what makes leaders outstanding. These are the leaders who, for example, take the time to help people develop further strengths. Take the time to give feedback, corrective feedback. They see that and are genuinely concerned about helping people get better, learn to do better, and that, of course, strengthens the capacity of the whole organization. That's also what makes people outstanding organizational citizens. These are the people who aren't just, it's me first and that's all I care about, but are good team players, are willing to help out other people and so on. So in this in a dark time economically, the leaders who will be most effective have all 3 capacities going at full strength.
Daniel, you once wrote a famous article on leadership after studying companies like PepsiCo. So can you tell us about that article?
I wrote an article for the Harvard Business Review in '98 called What Makes a Leader? And it was really an extension of the book I just finished called Working with Emotional Intelligence. The review asked me to talk about the competencies or abilities that you see in star-performing leaders. That article, by the way, has become their #1 most requested reprint in the history of the review. It really struck a chord. I think it did because it articulated something that people had sensed but not been able to put into words. Basically, what I argued is that there are 4 kinds of strengths that you see in the best leaders. One is self-awareness. People have the capacity to reflect on themselves, to monitor themselves. And this matters in many ways. One is for making good decisions. Turns out that you need to be able to capture that felt sense of feels right, doesn't feel right, and mix that into the hard data on a business decision or on a life decision. Should I keep this job or should I take a risk and take another job? That's not a decision you can make a list of pros and cons. You need to have a gut sense because there are ungraspables, things you can't put into words, that actually are important information that part of your brain knows, but only can tell you, not in words, but in a gut sense, literally a gut sense. That's the way we're wired. So people who make good or better decisions, business leaders, anyone, have this capacity for self-awareness. There's another way it's important, that is as an ethical guide. The answer to the question is what I'm about to do in keeping with my values doesn't come to us in words. It comes to us again in a gut sense. Then we put it into words. So this is critical for ethical navigation, both individually and for a company. The second component is self-management. How we handle our emotions. Can we keep our distressing emotions from crippling or interfering with our capacity to think well, to make good decisions? Can we stay focused, motivated, positively, working toward goals even when things are tough? Are we adaptable, flexible in making responses? All of that comes from internal self-management. The third part of emotional intelligence abilities for leaders is empathy. Do we sense how other people are thinking about a situation? Do we know how they feel? Can we establish rapport? Do we care? Are we concerned? Do we want to help others to the extent that we can? All of those are critical leadership abilities. And finally, there's the relationship skills, the obvious, more visible leadership competencies like effective communication is one. Can we inspire people? Can we motivate people? Can we articulate a shared mission from the heart that speaks to people's hearts, that really moves people? In other words, are we authentic leaders? Are we able to negotiate? Are we able to collaborate? Can we model collaboration so that people can see, hear that the leader is showing us how to be a good team player? All of those are highly effective leadership abilities, and the best leaders have strengths in at least 6 or more of those. Any leader, of course, can develop them if they have the proper help.
Daniel, you talk about leadership style and the impact on the workforce. And you mentioned that there is 6 styles of leadership. So can you just give us an outline of the styles and how they each have an impact on the workforce?
If you think about it at a kind of primal level, the real task of a leader in terms of the brain is to help people get and stay in the optimal internal state for working at their best. And many leaders shoot themselves in the foot by ignoring the fact that in any human group, the most powerful person in the group is the one people pay most attention to, put most importance on. What that most powerful person says and does has the most impact on the internal state, the emotional state of everyone else. So if you're looking for best results from the people that work for you, your responsibility is to drive the state that's going to help people be at their best and to avoid leading in a style that puts people in their worst state for performance. And what are the styles that help? Well, there are 4 at least that have very positive resonance and impact on people. The first is, you could call it the visionary, someone who articulates a goal that motivates us all. And that creates a very positive state, a very hopeful, forward-looking, goal-oriented way of working. The second is someone who's a coach, who really cares about the people that he or she is leading and helps people get better or get further toward their own career goals by, for example, getting an assignment that will stretch them and help them learn how to do something that they're going to need along the way. People appreciate that enormously, and that too creates a positive climate. A third is being affiliative, understanding that having a good time together is not a waste of time, that it creates a kind of a social capital that means that we have stronger connections, we can work better together. And then a fourth is the consensus leader, someone who feels that well, I may not know the best way to go forward. I need to ask other people. All of that has a positive impact. And then finally, 2 that don't work so well. One is a pace setter, someone who just leads by example and is very critical of other people who aren't as good as they are. And the command and control, the coercive style of leader, who is someone who doesn't mind blowing up at people, for example, thinks nothing of it, or humiliating them. And those 2 ways of impacting are the worst possible, because all people are going to be able to focus on after that interaction is how awful it was, how much they hate the boss.
But Daniel, is there a time and a place for command and control style leadership?
Being very strong and just ordering people to do things under normal circumstances has a negative impact, but in a genuine emergency it's quite appropriate.
Daniel, do you have any thoughts on what is the difference that makes the difference between a great CEO and just one that's destined for mediocrity?
You know, there's only one study I've ever seen that really systematically looked at CEOs where the data was released to the public, and it was done by the U.S. insurance industry, comparing CEOs of comparable insurance firms, with the same products, same size, same market, etc. And they looked at the leadership styles that the CEOs used. They found that if those leaders used 4 or more of the 6 leadership styles effectively and appropriately, their firms had stronger growth and profit quarter for quarter than firms where the CEOs tended to rely on the leadership styles that had negative impacts.
Interesting. So if a CEO was more congruent in terms of their natural style and personality with 1 or 2, should they force themselves from self-awareness to focus on the other 2?
These are leadership tools, and you need to, as a leader, I would recommend learning to use styles you may not be as comfortable with if they have positive impact, because that's going to help you be a better leader.
Daniel, in terms of predicting who is going to be in the top 10% of performers, i.e. the sort of the star performers, you say that EI, emotional intelligence, is more as a sort of a better gauge than IQ. So can you just tell me why that is the case?
It's very simple. Study after study shows that in order to be in a top profession, in order to be an engineer, in order to get an MBA, in order to get an MD, or be a top executive, you need to have an IQ that's about 1 standard deviation above normal or higher. That puts you at about 115 IQ. But then the studies show, after that, there is no correlation between your IQ and your actual effectiveness or success in that line of work. Whether you're a CEO, academic, an engineer, doesn't matter. Why? Because that is the IQ level you need to master the technical skills, and it's the cognitive capacity you need to handle that profession. But after that, think about it. Once you're in the field, you're competing with people who are about as smart as you are. There's really no... Throughout school, IQ is a huge advantage for grades. In the workplace, after you reach that criterion level, it has very little added benefit, and what makes the difference are your personal abilities. How you manage yourself. Do you stay motivated? Do you stay focused? Are you adaptable? Are you self-aware? And your interpersonal abilities. Can you read other people? Do you know how to get along well? Are you a good team player? Can you be a leader? And those all depend on emotional intelligence.
Daniel, I've got no doubt that people that are watching this are sold on your premise of emotional intelligence. But the big question I think people will be wanting to ask is, once you know your EI level, can you improve or can you become more emotionally intelligent?
Yeah, the good news is that you can improve emotional intelligence competencies. These are learned abilities that build from the fundamentals. So, for example, emotional self-control, staying calm under pressure. This is a capacity that can be learned. The steps are quite well known, but you need to, first of all, want to get better. Listening well, listening deeply. That's a critical empathy skill. And if you have poor listening habits, like the common cold of leadership, then you can improve. But again, you need to be motivated. Why? Because in adulthood, you have to undo, at the brain level, undo over-rehearsed habits. That's your habitual way of reacting. And build a new one until it becomes more strongly practiced than the old one. Then you'll do it naturally. And that takes real effort and real motivation.
Daniel, talking about self-motivation, what's the core essence of being self-driven and motivated to move forward as an individual?
I think that motivation has to be true, that you need to align the desire to improve with your own sense of values and purpose, what you really feel is important. What are your dreams? Where do you want to go in life? Is something holding you back? Can you change that for the better? That's the kind of genuine motivation that helps people really make the change.